Hi guys, welcome back to Mysteries Channel. I haven't done any chapters out of the book, The Children of Odin, so I'm going to do 2 chapters because one is super tiny. Odin tells Vidar, his silent son, the secret of his doings. It was not only to giants and men that Odin showed himself in the days when he went to Jotunheim and Midgard as Vegtem the Wanderer. He met and he spoke with the gods also, with one who lived far away from Asgard and with others who came to Midgard and to Jotunheim. The one who lived far away from Asgard was Vidar, Odin's silent son. Far within a wilderness with branches and tall grasses growing around him, Vidar sat, and near by him a horse grazed with a saddle upon it, a horse that was ever ready for a speedy journey. And Odin, now Vegtem the Wanderer, came into that silent place and spoke to Vidar, the silent god. "O Vidar," he said, "strangest of all my sons, God who will live when all of us have passed away, God who will bring the memory of the dwellers of Asgard into a world that will know not of their power. O Vidar, well do I know why there grazes near thee a horse ever ready for a speedy journey. It is that thou mayest spring upon it and ride unchecked, a son speeding to avenge his father. To you only, O Vidar the Silent One, will I speak of the secrets of my doings. Who but you can I know why I, Odin, the eldest of the gods, hung on the tree of Yggdrasil 9 days and 9 nights, mine own spear transfixing me. I hung upon the windy tree that I might learn the wisdom that would give me power in the 9 worlds. On the 9th night, the runes of wisdom appeared before mine eyes, and slipping down from the tree, I took them to myself. And I shall tell why my ravens fly to thee, carrying on their beaks straps of leather. It is that thou mayest make for thyself a sandal, and with that sandal on thou mayest put thy foot on the lower jaw of a mighty wolf and rend him. All the shoemakers of the earth throw on the ground scraps of leather they use so that thou mayest be able to make the sandal for thy wolf-rending foot. And I have counseled the dwellers on earth to cut off the fingernails and the toenails of their dead, lest from those fingernails and toenails the giants make for themselves the ship Naglfar, in which they will sail from north on the day of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. More, Vidar, I will tell to thee. I live amongst men, have wed the daughter of a hero. My son shall live as a mortal amongst mortals. Sigi his name shall be. From him shall spring the heroes who will fill Valhalla, my own hall in Asgard, with heroes against the day of our strife with the giants, and with Surtur of the flaming sword. For long Odin stayed in that silent place, communing with his silent son, with Vidar, who with his brother would live beyond the lives of the dwellers of Asgard, and who would bring into another day and another world the memory of the Aesir and the Vanir. For long Odin spoke with him, and then he went across the wilderness, where the grass and the bushes grew, and where the horse grazed in readiness for the sudden journey. He went toward the seashore, where the Aesir and the Vanir were now gathered for the feast that old Aegir, the giant king of the sea, had offered them. Thor and Loki in the giants' city. All but a few dwellers of the Asgard had come to the feast offered by Aegir, the giant king of the sea. Frigga, the queenly wife of Odin, was there. Frey and Freya, Idun, who guarded the apples of the youth, and Bragi, her husband, Tyr, the great swordsman, and Njord, the god of the sea. Gagi, who wedded Njord and whose hatred for Loki was fierce. And Sif, whose golden hair was once shorn off by Loki the mischievous. Thor and Loki were there. The dwellers of Asgard gathered together in the hall of the Aegir and waited for Odin. Before Odin came, Loki made the company merry by the tales that he told in Mockery of Thor. Loki long since had his lips unclosed from the thong that the dwarf Brock had sewn them with, and Thor had forgotten the wrong that he had done to Sif. Loki had been with Thor in his wanderings through Jotunheim, and about these wanderings he now told mocking tales. He told how he had seen Thor in his chariot of brass drawn by 2 goats across Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge. None of the Aesir or the Vanir knew of what adventure Thor was bent, but Loki followed him and Thor kept him in his company. As they traveled on in the brass chariot drawn by 2 goats, Thor told Loki of the adventures on which he had bent. He would go into Jotunheim, even into Utgard, the giant's city. and he would try his strength against the giants. He was not afraid of aught that might happen, for he carried Mjolnir, his hammer, with him. Their way was through Midgard, the world of men, and once, as they were traveling on, night came upon them as they were hungry and in need of shelter. They saw a peasant's hut, and they drove the chariot toward it, unyoking the goats and leaving them standing in a hollow. Beside the chariot, the two, looking not like dwellers in Asgard, but like men traveling through the country, knocked on the door of the hut and asked for food and shelter. They could have shelter, the peasant and his wife told him, but they could not have food. There was little in that place, and what little there had been, they had eaten for supper. The peasant showed them the inside of the hut. It was poor and it was bare. There was nothing there for anyone to give. And in the morning, the peasant said he would go down to the river and catch some fish for a meal. "We can't wait until morning. We must go now," said Thor, "and I think I can provide a good meal for us." He went over to where his goats stood, and in the hollow beside the chariot of brass, and striking them with a hammer, he left them lifeless on the ground. He skinned the goats then. Taking up the bones very carefully, he left them down on the skins. Skins and bones he lifted up, bringing them into the house, and he left them in a hole above the peasant's fireplace. "No one," said he in a commanding voice, "must touch the bones that I leave here." Then he brought the meat into the house. Soon it was cooked and laid smoking on the table. The peasant and his wife and his son sat around the board with Thor and Loki. They had not eaten plentiful for many days, and now the man and his woman fed themselves well. Thialfi was the name of the peasant's son. He was a growing lad and had an appetite that had not been satisfied for long. While the meat was on the table, his father and mother kept him going here and there, carrying water, putting faggots on the fire, and holding a blazing stick so that those at the table might see to eat. There was not much left for him when he was able to sit down, for Thor and Loki had great appetites, and the lad's father and mother had eaten to make up for the days of want. So Thialfi got little out of the plentiful feast. When the meal was finished, they lay down on benches. Thor, because he had made a long journey that day, slept very soundly. Thialfi lay down on the bench too, but his thoughts were still upon food. When they were all asleep, he thought he would take one of the bones that were in the skins above him and break and gnaw on it. So in the dead of the night, the lad stood up on the bench and looked down at the goat skins that Thor had left so carefully there. He took out a bone, broke it, and gnawed on it for the marrow. Loki was awake and saw him do this, but he, relishing mischief as much as ever, did nothing to stay the lad. He put the bone he had broken back in the skin, and he left the skins back in the hole above the fireplace. Then he went to sleep on the bench. In the morning, as soon as they were up, the first thing Thor did was to take the skin out of the hole. He carried them carefully out of the hollow where he had left the goats standing. He put each goat skin down with the bones in it. He struck each with a hammer, and the goats sprang up alive, horns, hooves, and all. But one was not as much as it had been before. He limped badly. Thor examined the leg and found that one bone was broken. In terrible anger, he turned on the peasants, his wife, and his son. "A bone of this goat has been broken under your roof," he shouted, "for that I shall destroy your house and leave you dead under it." Thialfi wept. Then he came forward and he touched the knees of Thor. "I did not know what harm I did," he said. "I broke the bone." Thor had his hammer lifted to crush him into the earth, but he could not bring it down on a weeping boy. He let his hammer rest on the ground again. "You will have to do much service for me for having lamed my goat," he said. "Come with me." And so the lad Thialfi went off with Thor and Loki. Thor took in his powerful hands the shafts of the chariot of brass, and he dragged it onto the lonely mountain hollow where neither man nor giants came. And they left the goats in a great empty forest to stay resting there until Thor made it back to them again. Thor and Loki and the lad Thialfi went across from Midgard to Jotunheim. Because of Mjolnir, the great hammer that he carried, Thor felt safe in the realm of giants, and Loki, who trusted in his own cunning, felt safe too. The lad Thialfi trusted in Thor so much that he had no fear. They were long in making the journey, and while they were traveling, Thor and Loki trained Thialfi to be a quick and strong lad. One day they came out to a moor. All day they crossed it, and at night it still stretched far before them. A great wind was blowing, night was falling, and they saw no shelter near. In the dusk, they saw a shape that looked to be a mountain, and they went toward it, hoping to find some shelter in a cave. Then Loki saw a lower shape that looked as if it might be a shelter. They walked around it, Loki and Thor and the lad Thialfi. It was a house, but a house most oddly shaped. The entrance was a long, wide hall with no doorway. When they entered this hall, they found 5 long, narrow chambers running off of it. "This is an odd place, but it is the best shelter we can get," Loki said. "You and I, Thor, will take the 2 largest rooms, and the lad Thialfi can take one of the little rooms." They entered their chambers and they lay down to sleep. But from the mountain outside there came a noise that was like moaning forests and falling cataracts. The chamber where each one slept was shaken by the noise. Neither Thor nor Loki nor the lad Thialfi slept that night. In the morning they left the 5-chambered house and turned their faces toward the mountain. It was not a mountain at all, but a giant. He was lying on the ground when they saw him, but just then he rolled over and sat up. Little men, he shouted to them. "Have you passed by a glove of mine on your way?" He stood up and he looked all around them. "Ho, I see my glove now," he said. Thor and Loki and the lad Thialfi stood still as the giant came toward them. He leaned over and he picked up the 5-room chambered house they had slept in. He put it in his hand. It was really his glove. Thor gripped his hammer and Loki and the lad Thialfi stood behind him, but the giant seemed good-humored enough. "Where might you be bound for, little men?" he said. "To Utgard in Jotunheim," Thor replied boldly. "Oh, that place," said the giant. "Come on, then I shall be with you so far. You can call me Skimir." "Can you give us breakfast?" said Thor. He spoke crossly, for he did not want it to appear that he had any reason to be afraid of the giant. "I can give you breakfast," said Skimir, "but I do not want to stop to eat now. We'll sit down as soon as I have an appetite. Come along now. Here's my wallet to carry. It has my provisions in it." He gave Thor his wallet. Thor put it on his back and put Thialfi sitting upon it. On and on the giant strode, and Thor and Loki were barely able to keep up with him. It was midday before he showed any signs of halting to take breakfast. They came to an enormous tree. Under it, Skimir sat down. "I'll sleep before I eat," he said, "but you can open my wallet, my little men, and take your meal out of it." Saying this, he stretched himself out, and in a few minutes Thor and Loki and the lad Thialfi heard the same sound as kept them awake the night before. Sounds that were like forests moaning and cataracts falling. It was Skimir's snoring. Thor and Loki and the lad Thialfi were too hungry now to be disturbed by these tremendous noises. Thor tried to open the wallet, but he found it not easy to undo the knots. Then Loki tried to open it, and in spite of all of Loki's cunning, he could not undo the knots either. Then Thor took the wallet from him and tried to break the knots by main strength. Not even Thor's strength could break them. He threw the wallet down in his rage. The snoring Skimir became louder and louder. Thor stood up in his rage. He grasped Mjolnir and he flung it at the head of the sleeping giant. The hammer struck him in the head, but Skimir only stirred in his sleep. "Did a leaf fall on my head?" he said. He turned around on the other side and he went back to sleep again. The hammer came back to Thor's hand, and as soon as Skimir snored, he flung it again, aiming at the giant's forehead. It struck there. The giant opened his eyes. "Has an acorn fallen on my forehead?" he said. Again he went to sleep, but now Thor, terribly roused, stood over his head with the hammer held in his hands high. He struck him on the forehead. It was the greatest blow that Thor had ever dealt. "A bird has pecked my forehead. There's no chance of sleep here," said Skimir, sitting up. "And you little men, did you have your breakfast yet? Toss over my wallet to me and I shall give you some provisions." The lad Thialfi brought him the wallet. Skimir opened it, took out his provisions, and gave a share to Thor and Loki and the lad Thialfi. Thor would not take provisions from him, but Loki and the lad Thialfi took it and ate. When the meal was finished, Skimir rose up and said, "Time for us to be going to Utgard." As they went on their way, Skimir talked to Loki. "I always feel very small when I go into Utgard," he said. "You see, I'm such a small and weak fellow, and the only folk who live there are so big and powerful. But you and your friends will be welcome in Utgard. They will be sure to make little pets of you." And then he left them and he went into Utgard, the city of the giants. The giants were going up and down the streets. They were not so huge as Skimir would have had them believe, Loki noticed. Utgard was the Asgard of the giants, but in its buildings there was not a line of the beauty that was in the places of the gods, Gladsheim and Breidablik or Filsanir. Huge but shapeless, the buildings arose like mountains or icebergs. Oh, beautiful Asgard with the dome above it, the deepest blue. Asgard with the clouds around it heaped up like mountains of diamonds. Asgard with its rainbow bridge and its glittering gates. Oh, beautiful Asgard, could it be indeed that these giants will one day overthrow you? Thor and Loki with the lad Thialfi went to the place of the king. The hammer that Thor gripped would, they knew, make them safe even there. They passed between the rows of giant guards and they came to the king's seat. "We know you, Thor and Loki," said the giant king, "and we know that Thor has come to Utgard to try his strength against the giants. We shall have a contest tomorrow. Today there are sports for our boys. If your young servant would like to try his swiftness against our youths, let him try the race today." Now Thialfi was the best runner in Midgard, and all the time he had been with Thor and Loki, they had trained him in quickness. And so Thialfi was not fearful of racing the giant youths. The king called on one named Hugi and placed him against Thialfi. The pair started together. Thialfi sped off. Loki and Thor watched the race anxiously, for they thought it would be well for them if they had a triumph over the dwellers in Utgard in the first contest. But they saw Hugi leave Thialfi behind. They saw the giant youth reach the winning post, circle around it, come back to the starting place before Thialfi even reached the end of the course. Thialfi, who did not know how it was that he had been beaten, asked that he be let run the race with Hugi again. The pair started off once more, and this time it did not seem to Thor or Loki that Hugi had left the starting place at all. He was back almost as soon as the race had started. They came back from racing around the palace. The giant king and his friends with Thor and Loki sat down to the supper table. "Tomorrow," said the king, "we shall have our great contest when Asa Thor will show us his power. Have you of Asgard ever heard of one who would enter a contest of eating? We might have a contest in eating at this supper board if we could get one who would match himself with Loki here. He can eat more than anyone in Jotunheim." "And I," said Loki, "can eat more than any two in Jotunheim. I will match myself against your Loki." "Good," said the giant king, and all the giants present said, "Good, this will be a sight worth seeing." Then they put scores of plates along the side of the table, each plate filled with meat. Loki began at one end and Loki at the other. They started to eat, moving toward each other as each plate cleared. Plate after plate was emptied, and Thor, standing with the giants, was amazed to see how much Loki ate. But Loki, on the other side, was leaving plate after plate emptied. At last, the two stood together with scores of plates on each side of them. "He has not defeated me," cried Loki. "I have cleared as many plates as your champion, O king of the giants." "But you have not cleared them so well," said the king. "Loki has eaten all the meat that was upon them," said Thor. "But Loki has eaten the bones and the meat," said the giant. "Look and see if it not be so." Thor went to the plates. Where Loki had eaten, there were bones left on the plates. Where Loki had eaten, nothing was left. The bones as well as the meat were consumed, and all the plates were left bare. "We are beaten," said Thor to Loki. "Tomorrow, Thor," said Loki, "you must show all your strength, or the giants will cease to dread the might of the dwellers in Asgard." "Be not afraid," said Thor. "Not one in Jotunheim will triumph over me." The next day, Thor and Loki came into the great hall of Utgard. The giant king was there with a throng of his friends. Thor marched into the hall with Mjolnir, his great hammer in his hands. "Our young men have been drinking out of this horn," said the king, "and they want to know if you, Asa Thor, would drink out of it a morning draught. But I must tell you that they think that no one of the Aesir could empty the horn in one draught." "Give it to me," said Thor. "There is no horn that you can put in my hand that I cannot empty in one draught." A great horn, brimmed and flowing, was brought over to him. Handing Mjolnir to Loki and bidding him stand to the side, Thor raised the horn to his mouth. He drank, and he felt sure that not a drop was left in the horn. As he laid it on the ground, there he gasped, "Your giant horn is drained." The giants looked within the horn and laughed. "Drained, Asa Thor," said the giant king. "Look into the horn again. You have hardly drank below the brim." And Thor looked into it and saw that the horn was not half emptied. In a mighty rage, he lifted to his lips again, drank and drank and drank. Then, satisfied that he had emptied it to the bottom, he left the horn on the ground, walked over to the other side of the hall. "Thor thinks that he has drained the horn," said one of the giants, lifting it up. "But see, friends, what remains in it." Thor strode back and looked in the horn. It was still half filled. He turned around to see that all the giants were laughing at him. Asa Thor, said the giant king, "we know not how you are going to deal with us in the next feat, but you certainly are not able to drink against giants." Said Thor, "I can lift up and sit down any being in your hall." As he said this, a great iron-colored cat bounced into the hall and stood before Thor, her back arched, her fur bristling. "Then lift the cat off the ground," said the giant king. Thor strode to the cat, determined to lift her up and fling her amongst the mocking giants. He put his hand to the cat, but he could not raise her up. Up, up went Thor's arms, up, up as high as they could go. But the cat's arched back went up to the roof, but her feet were never off the ground. And as he heaved and heaved with all his might, he heard the laughter of the giants all around him. He turned away, his eyes flaming with anger. I am not wont to try to lift cats, he said. Bring me one to wrestle with, and I swear you shall see me overthrow him. Here is one for you to wrestle with, Asa Thor, said the king. Thor looked around and saw an old woman hobbling toward him. She was blear-eyed and toothless. This is Elsie, my ancient nurse, said the giant king. She is the one we would have you wrestle with. Thor does not wrestle with old women. I will lay my hands on your tallest giant instead. Ellie has come where you are, said the giant king. Now it is she who will lay hands upon you. The old woman hobbled toward Thor. Her eyes gleamed under her falling fringes of gray hair. Thor stood, unable to move as the hag came toward him. She laid her hands upon his arms. Her feet began to trip at his. He tried to cast her from him. Then he found that her feet and her arms were as strong against his as bands and stakes of iron. Then began a wrestling match in earnest between Thor and the ancient crone Ellie. Round and round the hall they wrestled, and Thor was not able to bend the old woman backward nor sideways. Instead, he became less and less able under her terrible grasp. She forced him down, and at last he could only save himself from being left prone on the ground by throwing himself down on one knee and holding the old hag by his shoulders. She tried to force him down on the ground, but she could not do that. Then she broke from him, hobbled to the door, and went out of the hall. Thor rose up, took the hammer from Loki's hands. Without a word, he went out of the hall and along the ways towards the gate of the giants' city. He spoke no word to Loki, nor to the lad the Elfie, who went with him for the 7 weeks that they journeyed through Jotunheim.